Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma.
We hit hard Iran's defense capabilities and its ability to produce missiles that are aimed at us.
We start with West Asia, where weekends tend to be a busy affair. Beyond the bombings, which have unfortunately become par for the course, this time we saw Israel striking Iran. Yes, it's finally happened. After weeks of planning, Netanyahu and team finally attacked Iran. They called the airstrikes precise and targeted. It was retaliation. Earlier this month, Tehran had rained some 200 missiles on Israel. So this Friday, Israel fired back, although not on the same scale. It struck some 20 targets in Iran. And in the run-up to this, there was a lot of speculation. Would Israel attack Iran's nuclear and oil facilities? Some hawks in Israel certainly wanted to, but Netanyahu seems to have given in to American pressure. He opted for a limited operation, firing at Iran's defense system, its drone bases and weapons production facilities, specifically the missile and drone units around Tehran. Let's show you some pictures. This is one of the sites that the Israelis hit. Apparently, Iran had built this to test nuclear weapons. The IDF attacked it with jets and drones, and Netanyahu says, mission accomplished. He says Israel has achieved all of its goals.
The attack in Iran was precise and powerful and achieved all of its objectives.
4 Iranian soldiers were killed in this attack, and Tehran has vowed to avenge their death. Iran's president said they would give a quote-unquote appropriate response. At the same time, he said Iran does not want a war, and his statements have been measured and guarded. It's like both sides are going through the motions, Iran and Israel. They don't want to be seen as weak, but they want to avoid an escalation. Look at this report. It says that Israel gave a heads up to Iran before the strikes. It sent several messages to Tehran, which were delivered by intermediaries. Through these messages, Israel told Iran that it was planning to strike. It also outlined the targets and shared details like which sites will come under attack and which ones will be avoided. But why would Israel do this? To minimize damage on the Iranian side so that they don't feel compelled to launch a counterattack. Basically, Israel tried telling Iran, let this be the last attack. Unless you escalate from here, we won't strike again. But if you strike back, if you harm Israeli citizens, then the IDF will come back with greater force. Of course, Israel has neither confirmed nor denied any of these reports. These two countries, remember, are sworn enemies. They have no diplomatic relations. Iran does not even recognize the state of Israel. So officially, Israel would never confirm giving a tip-off to the Iranians before an attack. But it does make sense, this strategy, this approach gives two messages. One, Israel doesn't want an escalation from here. And two, it has also demonstrated its capabilities. It has shown Iran its reach, how its jets can breach the Iranian airspace and strike targets with pinpoint accuracy. And the message has reached the intended recipients. Iran's supreme leader said the attack should neither be exaggerated nor downplayed. More importantly, he did not call for retaliation.
Well, they made a mistake. They, of course, exaggerated it. Their exaggeration is wrong, but note that downplaying it is also wrong. Saying, no, there was nothing, it wasn't important, and this is also wrong.
So just the standard rhetoric from Tehran. From the looks of it, this may not escalate. And even if it did, it would not be the biggest challenge on Netanyahu's list. He is under immense pressure at home. His allies want him to take a ceasefire deal now. So far, the Israeli Prime Minister has ignored such calls, but it's getting harder by the day, given that his own defense minister is now challenging him. We are talking about Yoav Gallant. He has written a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu criticizing the war. He says Israel's war efforts have become aimless. We have a copy and a quote from that letter. This is what it says. Significant developments in the war, especially Israel and Iran trading direct blows, raise the necessity of holding a discussion and updating the war's goals with a comprehensive look. So Gallant is calling for a reassessment. But Netanyahu may not agree. Instead, he is looking to fire Gallant. That's what the Israeli press is reporting, that the Prime Minister wants to sack the defense minister. Meanwhile, public pressure is piling on. Over the weekend, Netanyahu was heckled by protesters. Reports say these were families of the hostages who are still in Gaza. They want a ceasefire so that their people can be brought back. Earlier, Egypt had proposed a new deal. Egypt is mediating between Israel and Hamas. It proposed a 2-day ceasefire in exchange for the release of 4 hostages. Netanyahu is said to have rejected that proposal. He doesn't want an end to the war, neither in Gaza nor in Lebanon, it seems. And in this scenario, the chances of an escalation with Iran and the risk of a wider war in West Asia will remain alive.
प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी और स्पेन के प्रधानमंत्री पेड्रो सांचेज संयुक्त रूप से उद्घाटन करेंगे जो C295 विमान।
The Spanish Prime Minister is in India. It's a country we don't talk about too often, not unless it's La Liga football or maybe over tourism. But this time it's hard politics. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez landed in India earlier today. Not in New Delhi though. He landed in Gujarat's Vadodara. It's his first trip to India as Prime Minister. Also the first by a Spanish Prime Minister in 18 years. It tells you a lot about this relationship. Cordial, but nothing special. Hopefully this visit will add a bit of momentum. But why Vadodara? Because Sanchez and Prime Minister Narendra Modi had to inaugurate a factory there, the Tata Airbus aircraft plant. It is India's first such private assembly line. The production, the testing, the delivery, the repairs, all of it will be done in Vadodara, in the same Tata campus. Sort of like a one-stop location for the aircraft. And what's the connection to Spain? Well, the aircraft is called the C295. It used to be manufactured by a Spanish defense company, but it later merged into Airbus. India has ordered 56 of these planes. 16 will be delivered from Spain. The remaining 40 will be made here in Vadodara. It's a big deal for the Indian Air Force. These planes can play multiple roles. They can carry troops, they can ferry cargo, carry out evacuations, and also the odd patrolling missions. They will replace India's aging fleet of Soviet Antonovs. The first C295 will roll out by 2026. The remaining by 2031. It's all part of the Make in India vision for defense. New Delhi has historically been a buyer in the arms market. But Prime Minister Modi wants to change that. He wants India to become a seller. He highlighted the progress made in the last decade.
भारत में डिफेंस मैन्युफैक्चरिंग इकोसिस्टम नई ऊंचाइयां छू रहा है। 10 साल पहले अगर हमने ठोस कदम नहीं उठाए होते तो आज इस मंजिल पर पहुंचना असंभव ही था।
This factory is a big first step. It will create around 3,000 direct jobs, plus it will create a supply chain. As you know, an aircraft requires hundreds of parts and electronics. The plan is to source them from across India, from MSMEs or medium and small enterprises. That will create another 15,000 indirect jobs. So we're talking about an ambitious plan. Once this military order is done, the factory can always make other planes, maybe even civilian aircraft. After the inauguration, the focus turned to diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi and Sanchez held a road show. Hundreds of people turned up to greet the two leaders. Take a look at this. roadshow done, it was time for talks. Prime Minister Modi hosted Sanchez at the Lakshmi Vilas Palace. Both leaders were joined by quite a large delegation. The Indian Prime Minister talked about deepening bilateral ties. Prime Minister Sanchez noted India's importance in the current geopolitical climate. This is what he said.
Excellency, Buenos Dias. नमस्कार। उसी प्रकार आपकी इस यात्रा से हमारे संबंधों में एक नई ऊर्जा और उत्साह का संचार हुआ है। आज C295 प्लांट के उद्घाटन के साथ साझेदारी के एक नए अध्याय की शुरुआत भी हुई है।
I am certain that this visit will strengthen our bilateral relations and will honor the weight and influence that both India and Spain have in the world. Complement each other. India plays a prominent role not only in the Indo-Pacific but also in the wider geopolitical context.
Modi and Sanchez have a tough job to turn this relationship into a consequential one. Bilateral trade is around $10 billion. Spain makes up 7% of India's trade with Europe. Robust, but not extraordinary. So what is Pedro Sanchez hoping to achieve in India? Maybe more options. You see, Sanchez has invested a lot in his relationship with China. He visited China twice in the last 18 months, even tried to delay EU tariffs on Chinese vehicles. But other European Union members do not agree with this approach, so they are tightening the screws on Beijing, which is perhaps why he's turning to India. And for New Delhi, Pedro Sanchez is a key ally to have. Spain is the fastest growing major economy in Europe, plus Sanchez is emerging as a force. He has defied the EU on a number of issues, whether it's giving tanks to Ukraine or opposing Israel or reaching out to China. Sanchez is carving out his own place in the bloc, and he can afford to do that. The likes of Macron and Olaf Scholz are facing domestic setbacks, but Pedro Sanchez is better placed at home. He's also flaunting Spain's historical ties to other parts of the world, like North Africa and Latin America, something that he did in India too.
Spain maintains privileged relations with Latin America, historic ties in the Middle East, increased presence in Africa, and is a leading voice in the European Union. This geopolitical framework offers many opportunities for our countries to reach different regions and develop closer and more productive relations.
So Spain is a good ally to have in Brussels, whether it's for free trade talks or defense deals or Indo-Pacific partnerships. It also tells you about India's long-term plans for Europe. Earlier, the engagement was limited to a few states, maybe France or Germany, but now it's much wider. This year, Prime Minister Modi visited Poland and Austria, and now the Spanish Prime Minister is visiting. So the plan is to build closer ties across the bloc. Of course, the strategy varies. With Germany, India is offering its skilled labor force. With Spain, India is offering tourism. With France, India is buying weapons. And with Poland, India is selling weapons. New Delhi realizes that Europe is looking for alternatives to China, both strategic and financial alternatives. So it is India's time to cash in. There's a big debate unfolding in the US. Should newspapers endorse politicians, specifically presidential candidates? Should you endorse presidential candidates as a newspaper? It may sound weird to some of you. You may wonder, shouldn't the media not take sides? But in the US, it is quite common. Ahead of elections, newspapers endorse one of the candidates. Not this time, though. This time, many newspapers are ditching the trend. The latest is a big name in US media, the Washington Post. They have decided to not endorse Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. And it's a big decision for them. The Post has endorsed candidates since the 1970s. The last time they did not was in 1988. That was the only exception since 1970. Back then, the Washington Post called both campaigns a national disappointment. It was George Bush versus Michael Dukakis. A very bitter campaign filled with personal attacks. So the Washington Post said neither candidate is worthy. Other than that, they've always backed someone. So why are they breaking tradition now? The official excuse is that the Post is going back to its roots before the 70s when they did not endorse candidates. That's the official excuse. Unofficially, because their owner said so. That's Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. He bought the Washington Post in 2013 and he doesn't want his newspaper to endorse anyone this time. For the record, the endorsement was ready. The Post was going to back Kamala Harris. They had even prepared a statement. But Jeff Bezos killed it. The obvious question is why? It's not like Trump and Bezos are fans of each other. Amazon sued Donald Trump during his presidency. So why the change of heart now? Perhaps for business. Amazon does a lot of business with the US government. Their space company, Blue Origin, has a contract with NASA, a $3.4 billion deal. On Friday, Blue Origin officials met Trump, the same day Washington Post announced its decision. And the logic is simple. If Trump wins, he could kill that deal. Or maybe keep Bezos out of future projects. After all, Trump is best buddies with Elon Musk, and Musk has his own space company. Chances are that influenced Jeff Bezos' decision. Most of the Post reporters are not happy with this call. Some of them have decided to quit. Some former journalists have called it a spineless decision. But let's take a step back here. Let's look at this tradition as a whole. When did US media start backing candidates? Why do they do it? And does it make an impact? The tradition itself is quite old. It dates back to the 1800s. Back then, America's media landscape was very different. It was called the party press. Editors would get funding and contracts from political parties. In return, they would endorse candidates, even push their policies and agendas. In the last century, the process became more refined. Editorial boards would get together, they would analyze policies, they would look at pros and cons of both sides, and finally, they would endorse one candidate. That said, it was more about principles and policy. That's what they said. It was more about principles and policy, not about who gave the paper money. But the ideological tilt was quite obvious. Just look at the Washington Post again. They have endorsed only Democrats since the 1970s. Same with the New York Times. They last endorsed a Republican in 1956. Even this time, they're backing Kamala Harris. Now, I know the obvious question. Doesn't this compromise journalistic integrity? You're openly endorsing a candidate. You clearly like their policy. So won't your reportage be biased? These newspapers say no. But let's face it, endorsing a candidate is a partisan act. It betrays your inherent bias. Some newspapers have started realizing that. Just look at these numbers. In 1940, only 13% newspapers did not endorse a candidate. Only 13%. The rest did endorse a candidate. The overwhelming majority endorsed a candidate in a US presidential election. By 1996, it had risen to 70%. So most US newspapers do not endorse a candidate anymore. Only a few are clinging on to this tradition. For example, the Wall Street Journal does not, nor does the USA Today. Which brings us to a final question. Does it sway voters? In the past, yes, it did. I'm talking about a time before social media, before every house had a television. Back then, newspaper endorsements did make a difference. If you look at all the races since the 1940s, more endorsements equaled more chances of winning. But recently that has changed. A, because trust in the media has fallen. Only 31% Americans trust traditional media outlets. So their endorsement is not valuable. In fact, in some cases, it can be counterproductive. And B, because social media is more important these days. People don't need newspapers to tell them what Trump stands for. They can just follow him on X or listen to his speeches on YouTube. Some of the recent elections reflect this trend. In 2004, John Kerry had more newspaper endorsements than George Bush. But Bush won the White House. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had 240 endorsements. Donald Trump had 6. Yet, it was Trump who won the election. And this time, Kamala Harris has 18 newspapers backing her. Trump has just 10. Yet the race is a dead heat. So maybe it's time to retire this tradition for the right reasons, of course. You should stop this practice because it is partisan. It is against the principle of neutrality, not because of fear of retribution. If it's the latter, it sort of defeats the point, doesn't it? So the US presidential campaign has entered its final week. With just 8 days to go, both candidates are leaving no stone unturned. On Sunday, Donald Trump was in New York City trying to make a statement with a mega rally. but it wasn't without some racist rhetoric. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris was in battleground Pennsylvania trying to woo voters by visiting restaurants and drinking some beer. As election day on November 5th looms, 2 new polls show that this will be a very close race. And more than 41 million people have cast an early vote. Our next report tells you more.
It was homecoming for Donald Trump. On Sunday, the former US president held a rally in New York City at Madison Square Garden. New York is where Trump was born. It's where he made his name as a property developer and a media personality. And this is the place he chose to deliver his grand closing pitch for this presidential election.
And now, please welcome our next Commander-in-Chief, my husband, President Donald J. Trump.
Trump was joined by his running mate J.D. Vance, Tesla CEO Elon Musk, billionaire Vivek Ramaswamy, conservative pundit Tucker Carlson, and many other high-profile supporters.
As you can see, I'm not just MAGA, I'm dark, gothic MAGA. Well, the energy in this room is incredible.
I'll tell you something, I don't follow the polls, I don't follow the pundits, but I follow the energy. And this does not feel like second place energy in here tonight.
I don't see no stinking Nazis in here. I don't see no stinking domestic terrorists in here. The only thing I see in here are a bunch of hard-working men and women that are real Americans, brother.
The rally was all about making America great again. Donald Trump played to his base, talking about illegal migration and attacking Kamala Harris.
If Kamala Harris gets 4 more years, our economy can never recover. If I win, we will quickly build the greatest economy in the history of the world. Which is what we had in our last term. We will rapidly defeat inflation, and we will very simply make America affordable again. We're going to make it affordable.
There were some insults and even some racist rhetoric.
It is absolutely wild times. It really, really is. And, there's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico. Okay. All right. Okay.
Puerto Rico is a Caribbean island, also an unincorporated territory of the United States. It is located 1,600 kilometers from the coast of Miami, yet it is center stage in this year's presidential election. Puerto Rico is home to 3.2 million US citizens, and the comments did not go down well with them. But it could become a bigger problem in Pennsylvania. It's a swing state and also home to 580,000 Latino voters. The majority of them are of Puerto Rican descent. So obviously, the Trump campaign tried to distance themselves from the comments. On the other hand, Kamala Harris made a pitch to Puerto Rican voters. From a barber shop to a Puerto Rican restaurant, she traveled through Pennsylvania, trying to win the crucial battleground state.
Here in Pennsylvania right now, each of us has an opportunity to make a difference. Because in this moment, we do face a real question. What kind of country do we want to live in?
The new surveys show a tight race with both candidates neck and neck. In one poll, Kamala Harris is leading Donald Trump by 50% to 49%. In another, she's leading by 51% to Trump's 47%. But both are within the margin of error. And the Democrats know this, so they brought out the big guns this weekend.
It's impossible not to feel the energy in this room, the positivity, the community, the humanity. We are at the precipice of an incredible shift, the brink of history.
So I hope you'll forgive me if I'm a little frustrated that some of us are choosing to ignore Donald Trump's gross incompetence while asking Kamala to dazzle us at every turn. I hope.
With just 8 days to go, candidates are ramping up their campaign blitz. 41 million Americans have already cast their ballot in what's turning out to be one of America's tightest elections in decades.
Now let's take a look at a different election, the one that just took place in Japan. Japan got a new prime minister this month. His name is Shigeru Ishiba. He took charge on the 1st of October, but he wasn't elected by the public. He won support from within his own party, the ruling party of Japan called LDP, or the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP. They elected him to be prime minister, but that wasn't enough for Ishiba. He wanted a public mandate as well, so he moved fast. Ishiba became party leader on September 27th. He was sworn in as Prime Minister on October 1st. On the 8th of October, he dissolved Japan's parliament. A week later, on October 15th, he announced elections for October 27th. That was the election date, October 27. So Japanese voters had some 12 days to get ready and vote. Compare that to the endless theatrics in the US. It makes Japan seem far more practical. But despite his unhesitant actions, Ishiba was taking a gamble. Holding snap elections had the potential to backfire, and they did. Japan's ruling party has lost its parliamentary majority. Let's show you the results. Japan has 465 parliamentary seats. The ruling party, the LDP, got 191 seats, down from 259. Before this election, the LDP alone held a majority. Now it doesn't even command half the House alongside its coalition partner. Japan's ruling coalition now has 215 seats, which is less than the halfway mark of 233. This means that Japan is heading for political uncertainty.
Our Liberal Democratic Party and the Komeito Party, which together make up the coalition government, have lost so many talented people, and it is very regrettable. The Liberal Democratic Party must take this matter seriously, reflect on it from the bottom of our hearts, and be reborn.
Ishiba's Liberal Democratic Party has ruled Japan almost continuously since 1955. That's when the party was formed. So they've been in power for almost 70 years. The LDP has been ruling uninterrupted since 2012. However, for the last 2 years, it has been struggling because of various scandals. It started back in 2022 with the assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Abe was shot dead in July 2022 by a man who held a grudge against a religious institution known as the Unification Church. The assassination horrified the people of Japan. It also highlighted links between the church and Japan's ruling party, LDP. Those ties angered the people of Japan and caused the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party's popularity to tank. That was the first blow. But an arguably bigger one came the following year. It's known as the slush fund scandal. In late 2023, some LDP lawmakers were caught diverting political donations. They took donations but did not report them, and then diverted this money into private slush funds. The total amount was about $4 million, which is not the biggest corruption scandal in the world by any means, but it infuriated the people of Japan. The Prime Minister at the time, Fumio Kishida, bore the brunt of public anger. His approval ratings hit 23% in December 2023 and kept falling after that. That is why he decided to step down as party leader this year, and it is how Shigeru Ishiba took over as Prime Minister. Ishiba came in as a fresh face. He was supposed to help the people of Japan forget their anger, but he called the snap polls before the people got the chance to see him in action. And he made another mistake. He secretly kept funding politicians tainted by the slush fund scandal. This might have been his undoing. Ishiba and the LDP had officially distanced themselves from the corrupt lawmakers. The lawmakers were not endorsed by the party during the snap election, but they were allowed to contest as independents. And that should have been that. But last week, news broke that the LDP was secretly funding these tainted candidates. They were given 20 million yen to campaign. And this is Japanese taxpayer money, by the way. It comes up to about $130,000. This money was given to party branches that were run by the tainted candidates. And the same amount was also given to candidates who were endorsed by the party. So basically, the LDP was still funding corrupt lawmakers while pretending to distance themselves in public. This outraged the Japanese public further, that too on the eve of elections. The result reflects this anger.
It thought that Liberal Democratic Party will lose seats, though I didn't expect them to lose that many. I guess they were knocked out by that transfer of 20 million yen.
I think this is a natural result, because even though it is a hidden fund, it is still taxpayer money, and how we use that taxpayer money is very important to us.
So what happens next? Well, Japan is holding a special parliamentary session on the 11th of November. That is when they will choose their new prime minister. The LDP is still the biggest party in parliament, but their coalition is 18 seats shy of the halfway mark. So they could choose to add another party to their coalition. Ishiba has ruled that out for now, but he may still get outside support from some of the other parties. It's unlikely that Japan's opposition parties can oust the LDP, not unless all of them come together, which is a long shot. So for now, the LDP may continue to rule. But Ishiba may or may not be in charge. He is the one who led his party to this debacle. So he may have to take responsibility and step aside. We'll know for sure in the next 2 weeks, but one thing is already certain: Japan is looking at chaos in the near future. Now let's talk about the war in Ukraine. As the US election draws closer, Zelensky is making frantic appeals, but they're getting drowned out by the conflict in West Asia. Zelensky wants the West to support his victory plan. He wants them to push Russia towards a truce, but on his terms. The problem is he hasn't found takers for this. So the Ukrainian president is shifting his focus to the global south, specifically to India. He believes that India can play a role in the negotiations. According to Zelensky, Prime Minister Modi can influence the course of this war. But will Russia agree to a negotiated truce now, at a time when Russian forces are gearing up to escalate and North Korean soldiers have arrived to fight with them? Here's a report.
These are North Korean soldiers. Most of these men appear young, somewhere in their 20s. Perhaps even younger. They've never traveled outside their country, but now they're on Russian soil.
I can confirm that North Korean troops have been sent to Russia and that North Korean military units have been deployed to the Kursk region.
Soon, these troops will be dispatched to the front lines. Their mission is to fight the Ukrainian forces. Last week, the Russian president was asked about this, but as always, Putin kept his cards close to his chest.
Images are a serious thing. If there are images, then they reflect something. We are in touch with our North Korean friends, and we will see how this process develops.
The entry of North Korean troops adds a new dimension to this conflict. This isn't the first time Pyongyang has helped Moscow out. At the beginning of the conflict, North Korea supplied Russia with bombs. But now, Kim Jong-un is supplying soldiers to the Russian forces. It's a much bigger escalation. And Zelensky himself has termed it a serious challenge.
In particular, we have information that 2 units of military personnel from North Korea are being trained, potentially even 2 brigades of 6,000 people each. And this is a challenge.
How will Zelensky respond? Well, his options remain limited. For months now, Ukraine has pushed the West for more lethal firepower. This includes a request to lift restrictions on long-range attacks. But so far, the US and its NATO allies have been non-committal. Instead, they continue to issue verbal warnings.
Let's be clear. If North Korean soldiers do enter into combat, this development would demonstrate Russia's growing desperation in its war against Ukraine.
But more rhetoric won't help Ukraine. Zelensky perhaps realizes this himself. He's looking for tangible assistance, and he's reaching out to the global south again. Zelensky has made a fresh appeal to the Indian Prime Minister. He says that Prime Minister Modi could mediate between Ukraine and Russia. He's even willing to let India host the next peace summit. But his appeal may not be well received in New Delhi because it comes with a rant against India's time-tested friendship with Russia. Zelensky says that India should act against Russia. It should block the Russian economy and halt purchases of cheap energy, and extend more support to bring back Ukrainian children from Russia. If Zelensky's goal is to win India over, statements like this may work against him. Diplomacy doesn't work through ultimatums, especially if you're on the back foot.
Now let's turn our attention to Pakistan. India's broke neighbor is staying true to form. Once again, Islamabad is on the hunt for loans. It has been knocking on a number of doors. The International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Islamic Trade Finance Corporation. Everywhere you look, Pakistan's finance minister is trying to strike some sort of deal. But the biggest fish he's after is Pakistan's go-to piggy bank, China. China recently deferred some of Pakistan's loan repayments, but Islamabad isn't done yet. It wants an additional $1.4 billion in loan from Beijing and even more debt rolled over. Here's our report.
Pakistan's finance minister Mohammad Aurangzeb has had a busy week. He was in Washington, D.C. for the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group. Islamabad secured a $7 billion IMF loan just last month. The fund also released about $1.1 billion as the first tranche of the loan. So, of course, Aurangzeb had to attend the annual meeting. He had to provide updates about how that money was being used. Now, the IMF World Bank annual meeting is like a gala for the financing world. The who's who of financial organizations drop in to visit. So, for Aurangzeb and Pakistan, that meant more potential lenders. Pakistan is in deep debt. It owes money to the IMF and other institutional lenders like the Islamic Development Bank. It owes money to commercial banks, to bilateral lenders like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and of course China. But despite this, Islamabad still doesn't have its house in order. It's still looking for more loans. And when you go through Aurangzeb's itinerary, it shows that he's been knocking on every single door. He met the Saudi Arabian finance minister, the Turkish finance minister, the Emirati finance minister, China's vice minister of finance, and even the British minister for development. He also met with the representatives of a number of institutions, the Islamic Development Bank, the Dubai Islamic Bank, the Mashreq Bank, JP Morgan. You name the institution and Aurangzeb was there. It seems most of these places weren't too interested in any fresh loan pitch. So Aurangzeb thanked them and moved on to the next mark. But once in a while, he struck gold. The Islamic Trade Financing Corporation has agreed to give Pakistan $3 billion over the next 3 years. About $269 million will be provided immediately. Then the Asian Development Bank has agreed to consider a $500 million loan. It's officially to support environmental protection in Pakistan. But let's face it, Islamabad might just use that money to address other financial concerns. The ADB is expected to take a decision on the loan tomorrow. It's not final yet, but Aurangzeb is already thanking them in anticipation. He also tried his climate cash scheme on the IMF. The IMF has already agreed to give Pakistan $7 billion. But Aurangzeb wants another billion from the IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Again, officially, this will be to help Pakistan mitigate climate risks. Let's see if the IMF bites. Now, as you can see, Pakistan's finance minister had quite the week. But he saved the best for last. This weekend, Aurangzeb presented his new plan to get more money from China. China is already Pakistan's largest bilateral lender. Beijing has lent billions to Islamabad, far more than it can afford to pay back. So, how does Pakistan plan to deal with this? By taking even more money from China. Yes, Pakistan has asked for an additional 1.4 billion from China. China hasn't agreed to this yet, and it has rejected similar proposals in the past. But that hasn't stopped Pakistan from trying. It's actually targeting China with several other schemes as well, from another debt rollover to a new financing scheme. Pakistan plans to launch bonds in China's currency, the yuan. These will be issued to Chinese customers. All this goes to show that nothing has changed for Pakistan. After all that recent talk of better financial management, Islamabad is still hooked on loans. No matter how much China or the IMF pour in, it won't be enough to bring Pakistan out of the hole it has dug itself into.
It's been almost 3 months since the so-called Dhaka Spring, since the promises of a new Bangladesh. But this new Bangladesh is looking a lot like old East Pakistan. Sheikh Hasina's aides are on trial, Hindus are being targeted, they're being fired from their jobs, and they're marching on the streets for justice. What is Mohammed Yunus doing about all of this? Well, he's busy defending it. Yunus has said that these are not anti-Hindu attacks. These are anti-Hasina attacks. He says Hindus supported the previous regime of Sheikh Hasina, hence they're being targeted. And he is using the same logic against India. Sheikh Hasina's aides are set to appear in court next month. Hasina herself will be called up soon. When that happens, will Mohammed Yunus pick a fight with India, or will he show some maturity? Our next report tells you.
This was Chittagong on Friday. A sea of Hindu people swamped the streets in protest. Their demand? Equal rights, to not be treated as second-class citizens. Hindus make up about 8% of Bangladesh's population. Under Sheikh Hasina, they prospered. She kept the radical Islamists at bay. But now, there's a target on their back. Local reports say direct attacks have subsided. Now, the tactics have changed. Hindus are being pressured to resign from their jobs, like Rontu Das, an assistant professor at Chittagong University. Radicals issued death threats to him, so Das has decided to step down. It's the same with police trainees. 252 sub-inspectors have been dismissed by the Yunus regime. Around 91 of them are Hindu. Many of them have alleged discrimination. Since the government isn't listening, they have hit the streets. The Hindu groups have 8 demands. Among them is setting up a Ministry of Minority Affairs, enacting a Minority Protection Act, and declaring public holidays on Hindu festivals. But Yunus is unlikely to accept these demands. He doesn't see these attacks as religious. He sees them as political revenge.
When you say minority community is being attacked, that minority community, particularly Hindu community, was associated with Sheikh Hasina. So you cannot distinguish whether they were attacked because they are followers of Sheikh Hasina or they were attacked because they are Hindu.
The root cause is an obsession with the past. Radical elements are keen on erasing Bangladesh's liberation history. Sheikh Hasina used to crack down on them, so now they want revenge. And Yunus is playing along. Dhaka's International Crimes Tribunal is probing Hasina's regime. 10 of her ministers have been asked to appear by November 18th. Their charges? Crimes against humanity and genocide. Hasina too is on the tribunal's radar. She has been asked to appear next month. Of course, Hasina isn't in Bangladesh. She's staying in New Delhi under India's protection. chances are that this will trigger a standoff. Yunus's ministers have already dropped hints. They have promised a strong protest if India does not extradite her. And Yunus isn't done yet. He visited Hasina's former residence today, the same one that was stormed by student protesters in August. The place is almost in ruins now. Abusive graffiti on the walls, bedrooms ransacked, and valuables stolen. Yunus wants to turn this building into a memorial, a reminder of Hasina's downfall. What drives this obsession with the past? This need to erase Hasina's legacy? Perhaps some old wounds? Hasina was no fan of Mohammad Yunus. She accused him of sucking blood from the poor. She even charged him in more than 100 corruption cases. As a result, Yunus couldn't return to Bangladesh, not until Hasina had been toppled. Could those bitter memories be driving Yunus now? It's impossible to say, but one thing is clear. Yunus's actions are endangering a lot. Bangladesh's long-standing ties with India, its hard-fought secular identity, and the trust of its Hindu minority.
Our next story is set in Georgia. It's a Black Sea nation straddling West Asia and Eastern Europe, and it is at a crossroads. On Saturday, the country went to polls. It was called Georgia's most crucial election since the country's independence. It was less about choosing parties and more about choosing between the West and Russia. Most exit polls showed a close election. In the end, Georgia's ruling party won the election with 54% of the votes. The president has now accused Russia of meddling. She says Moscow orchestrated an election fraud. So were Georgia's elections rigged? And what does it mean for the country's future? Here's a report.
This is Georgia, a South Caucasus nation bordering Russia. In 1991, it gained independence when the Soviet Union fell. Since then, it's been a battleground of conflicting interests between the West and Russia. For the last 3 decades, Georgia has been pro-West. It even fought a war with Moscow in 2008. 80% of its people want to join the European Union. Which brings us to the ruling party, the Georgian Dream. It's owned by billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili. In 2014, it got its first stint in power, and it was seen as a pro-European party. During the first term, it enjoyed close relations with Brussels. But things changed in recent years. Ivanishvili's businesses were in Russia. It's where he made his money. And the party's tilt slowly became visible. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Georgia's government did not support the Western sanctions. It also promoted deeper relations with Russia. What about Georgia's opposition? The biggest opposition party is the United National Movement, or UNM. It was founded by Mikhail Saakashvili. He's a former president who's currently in prison. The opposition calls this arrest politically motivated. Exit polls conducted by Western pollsters predicted a close election, but the result was very different. Not only did the Georgian Dream win, it did so by securing 54% of the total votes. The UNM only managed to get around 10% of the votes. Even with all the opposition groups coming together, they won only 37% of the total votes. This hasn't gone down well with the country's pro-Western president or the opposition groups. Georgia's president says she does not recognize the results and has accused Russia of a special operation.
As the last independent institution in this country, I must clearly state that I do not recognize these elections. Recognizing them would be tantamount to legitimizing Russia's takeover of Georgia.
Observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe say that there was evidence of democratic backsliding. Meanwhile, Europe wants a probe into these elections and says there have been irregularities.
Here we have made it clear that the EU expects the Georgian Central Election Commission and other relevant authorities to fulfill their duties, to swiftly, transparently, and independently investigate and adjudicate electoral irregularities and allegations thereof. Those irregularities must be clarified and addressed.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has rejected all accusations of election interference. Moscow says there was no intervention from its side and has instead accused Europe of trying to influence the outcome of the polls. Georgia's opposition has now called for mass protests. It won't be the first in the country. Georgia was rocked by mass protests earlier this year over a controversial foreign agents bill. This election puts the country at a crossroads again. For long, it has deepened its relationship with the West due to the unpopular Soviet sentiment in the country. But the recent tilt towards Russia indicates that Georgia may be in Moscow's orbit again.
Play a game on your phone and there's a sports betting ad. Listen to a podcast and there is another one there. Open social media and you'll find celebrities talking about betting wins. Gambling has reached new levels worldwide and so has the threat it poses to global health. A new report is out. It says 450 million people have been harmed by gambling the world over. 450 million people. They've been harmed from the risk of financial ruin to family breakdown, increased risk of suicide, domestic violence and loss of employment. Whether personally, professionally, physically or mentally, 450 million people face some kind of negative consequence because of gambling. And out of this, at least 80 million people face severe consequences. They suffer from what's being called gambling disorder. This is a mental health condition. It involves compulsive gambling for the rare high from wins, denial that there is a problem, and the inability to call it quits. Gambling addiction is a lot like substance addiction. It is a vicious cycle. It is difficult to break, despite the losses, despite the guilt. And today, millions are going through this, both young and old. About 16% adults and 26% adolescents who gamble suffer from this disorder. This is a sign of our times. It has become easier than ever to slip into gambling addiction. The industry is expanding rapidly. You don't need a lottery ticket anymore. You can access a casino 24 hours a day thanks to that mobile phone in your pocket. And this is the result. Online casino and online sports betting are the most rapidly expanding areas for gambling globally. As the internet reach widens, so does the reach of the gambling industry, which has an ace up its sleeve: marketing. Incisive and sophisticated marketing with a barrage of ads. Gambling is a booming market. It is worth about $774 billion. It is expected to reach $1 trillion by 2030, mostly thanks to online gambling. It is expected to have about 300 million users by the end of this decade. So this is a difficult battle, especially for countries like India, where gambling is complex and controversial. India has varying laws in different states, most of which prohibit gambling, with some exceptions like lottery and horse racing. Goa, Daman and Sikkim allow casinos. Meanwhile, online gambling is a legal grey area. No national law prohibits it, but it is banned in Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. Despite the prohibitions, illegal gambling is reportedly widespread in the country. It is estimated to be a $60 billion market. And its online market is said to have more than 12 million users. What about other nations? Japan, Qatar, Poland and several others ban gambling. In countries like the UK and Australia, gambling is legal. Meanwhile, some countries have had a change of heart. France, for instance, is thinking about legalizing online casinos. Last year, Brazil legalized them. And in 2018, the US overturned a ban on sports betting. Since then, most states have permitted gambling, making the US one of the biggest gambling markets in the world, worth about $67 billion. So this is the gist of it. Countries do not know how to deal with gambling. Some are betting on it for tax revenue and legalizing gambling. Others want to ban it, but their execution fails on the ground. Countries do not know what is right. But one thing is clear, legal or not, the world needs stronger regulation to curb the impact of commercial gambling. Else, we are gambling with public health. Missiles are dropping fast in West Asia, but not as fast as memes. I'm guessing social media was bracing for Israel's attack on Iran because the jokes came immediately. From stocks to bitcoins to interest rates, most of them focused on the financial side of things. Plus, this is Diwali season in India, a festival where people fire rockets into the air. Not the Israeli kind, of course. These are firecrackers. So put together, they made for some funny memes. Take a look at this. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Russia, Kalidasa's Shakuntalam was performed at the Olonko Theatre in Yakutsk. Thailand's king marks his 72nd birthday with a ceremonial royal barge procession. And the Day of the Dead comes alive in Mexico as people parade around in skeleton costumes. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1886, the Statue of Liberty was officially dedicated to America. It was a gift from France to the United States. The dismantled statue arrived in New York, enclosed in over 200 packing cases. It was then reassembled in the New York harbor. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Kamala mentioned my name, I think, 21 times. She didn't mention the border. She didn't mention inflation. She didn't mention anything but my name over and over and over again.
The countdown to the 5th of November is on, with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump vying for the Oval Office. So, who will become America's next president? While around 240 million people will vote to pick the United States' 47th Commander-in-Chief, a relatively small number of them are likely to settle this pivotal question. A handful of the 50 states could hold the key to the White House. These are called the swing states. As the name goes, they could swing either Democrat or Republican. They're also known as battleground states or purple states. they could potentially be won by either candidate. So parties tend to spend disproportionate amount of time, resources and energy on bagging these states. One way to identify swing states is political realignment, and the other is tight margins in races. In 2020, the states that voted for current President Joe Biden, who's a Democrat, but chose former Republican President Donald Trump in 2016, have been highlighted as swing states. They are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. These 5 states, along with North Carolina and Nevada, were won by a margin of 3 percentage points or less. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's campaigns have been at full throttle to win over the voters in these states. Let's look at each swing state in the 2024 US presidential election. Arizona, also known as the Grand Canyon State. In the 2020 race, Arizona, for the first time since 1996, voted to back a Democrat. For decades, the state has been characterized as red, but Joe Biden flipped it by about 10,000 votes in 2020. The state borders Mexico, so it has been at the center of a raging immigration debate. The issue has been a top concern among voters. Though border crossings have fallen in recent months, they hit a record high in December 2023 and January 2024. But Donald Trump has repeatedly attacked Vice President Harris on the current administration's record on immigration. The former US president has also promised the largest deportation operation in US history if he's back in the White House. Apart from immigration, abortion access has also left Arizona divided. State Republicans attempted to bring back a 160-year-old near-complete ban on terminating pregnancies, but the move was foiled. Next up is Georgia, the Peach State. It's a critical battleground state for both leaders as they struggle to gain the voters' attention. In 2020, Joe Biden flipped the state, which was held by the Republicans since 1996. Biden won the state by a 0.2% margin. Though the margin was too little to call it a decisive win, it was key to Biden's path to the presidency. It was here in Georgia's Fulton County where Donald Trump was accused of election interference, landing him in one of his 4 criminal prosecutions. Trump and 18 others have been accused of conspiring to overturn the narrow defeat in the state. He, however, denies any wrongdoing. A third of Georgia's population is African American. The state has one of the country's largest proportions of black residents. Analysts say this demographic was pivotal in Joe Biden flipping the state in the last election. Moving now to Michigan, the Great Lakes state. It has picked the winning presidential candidate in the last 2 elections. Michigan had been reliably blue since 1992 after voting exclusively Republican in the 1970s and 80s. But in 2016, it turned into a major battleground after Trump won there by less than 11,000 votes. In 2020, Joe Biden swung the state back to blue with a wider margin. But currently, the state has become symbolic of countrywide anger against President Biden due to his support for Israel in its war against Gaza. During the Michigan Democratic primary contest in February, when Joe Biden was still running for a second term in office, over 100,000 voters chose uncommitted on their ballots. Kamala Harris has taken a slightly tougher stance on Israel. But whether it will be enough to change the voters' minds, well, we'll find out in November. Next is Nevada. The Silver State has been a more traditional example of a swing state. In the last 4 elections, the state voted blue. But Nevada voted Republican from the 1960s through the early 2000s. The only exception was Bill Clinton, who won the state in 1992 and again in 96. Experts say there are signs of a possible return to its Republican roots. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are hoping to win the state's sizable Latino population. Unemployment is also one of the major concerns here. The state has the highest unemployment rate in the US at 5.1% after California and the District of Columbia. Then there's North Carolina, the Tar Heel state of the old North State. Since 1980, it has voted Republican in every single election except 2008, choosing Barack Obama. In recent presidential contests, the victory margins have been razor thin. In 2020, the victory margin in North Carolina was just 1.3%. Poll pundits say it will be a toss-up in November, since the race is extremely tight with no clear winner. The sixth on the list of swing states is Pennsylvania. With 19 electoral votes, it's the most important swing state this November. The Keystone State clinched the presidency for Joe Biden in 2020. The big question is, can Kamala Harris keep it blue? Both sides have campaigned hard in the state. Donald Trump even survived an assassination attempt here after a bullet dodged past him and hurt his ear. Donald Trump broke the blue streak in the state with his 2016 victory. But 4 years later, in 2020, Biden secured a blue wall that also included Michigan and Wisconsin. Now Trump is hoping to lure Pennsylvania voters back. The seventh and final one is Wisconsin, the Badger State. It also picked the winning candidate in both the 2016 and 2020 elections, but only by a margin of around 20,000 votes each time. Since 1988, Wisconsin had been a reliably blue Rust Belt state. Trump broke that streak in 2016 and turned it red. Analysts say it's states like Wisconsin where an impact could be made by third-party candidates. Among them is Green Party's Jill Stein. The Democrats have been fighting to remove her from the ballot in Wisconsin, saying that the Green Party did not comply with the state election laws. Republican candidate Donald Trump has described the state as really important. He said, and I quote, "If we win Wisconsin, we win the whole thing." The Republican National Convention was held in Milwaukee. Kamala Harris was also rallying in the same city when the Democratic Convention nominated her as their presidential candidate. In the United States, when a sitting president is up for a re-election, fewer states tend to change parties. In the past 8 US presidential elections, the 1992 election had the highest number of states that switched sides. 22 states flipped. It's often called the year of political realignment, when Democrat Bill Clinton defeated incumbent President George H. Bush. In 1992, states including Colorado, Maryland, and even California, which had voted Republican for years, chose to go blue, and then reliably stayed that way for the next decade. Can 2024 be another year of political realignment in US history? Well, we'll find out on the 5th of November.
On the 5th of November, millions of voters in the United States will cast their ballot to elect their next president. However, there's a catch. The world's oldest democracy does not hold elections which can be considered as the easiest to understand. In fact, the American voting system is quite complicated. Now, most democracies in the world follow something that's called the popular vote, where voters directly cast their ballots to a political party or leader. It's a direct transfer of the vote from the voter to whoever is on the ballot. But the United States does not follow this. In fact, it's the only democracy in the world that has an indirect voting system called the Electoral College. Simply put, the Electoral College is a process of voting. It's not really a college. It was established in 1787 AD and was included in the US Constitution by the Founding Fathers. The Electoral College is basically the selection of electors who are called delegates. On the 5th of November, when Americans will queue up to vote, they won't actually be voting for their next president. Instead, they'll actually be voting for delegates who represent their respective states, and these delegates will then vote for the president. So, how does the Electoral College work? The Electoral College is made up of 538 delegates. You must be wondering where the number 538 comes from. It's the number of senators and representatives from each of the 50 states. The breakdown of 538 includes exactly 100 senators, 2 from each state, and 438 representatives from the 50 states. Each state's number of representatives is based on its population. Let's take a closer look with an example. California and Texas are the 2 most populous states, and so they have a higher number of representatives. However, regardless of the population of the states, each of them gets 3 votes to start with. The remaining are then added depending on the population of the state. However, that does not mean that the states with a higher population enjoy more voting rights. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. Let's take the example of 2 states. The population of Texas is over 29 million. On the other hand, Alaska has a much smaller population of just above 700,000. However, each representative from Texas and Alaska roughly represents the same proportion of the population. So, as Texas gets 38 representatives in the US Congress, Alaska gets 3. And this makes voting different in Texas and Alaska, because each of the 38 delegates from Texas now represent roughly over 760,000 people. Meanwhile, each delegate from Alaska represents over 250,000 people. Basically, it takes 760,000 people from Texas to get 1 vote, but it just takes 250,000 people from Alaska to get that same 1 vote. So the vote in Alaska can be considered a lot more influential. When Americans go to polls in November, they aren't exactly voting for the president directly, but their state's representatives, whether that's Democrat or Republican. And then these delegates give their votes to the presidential candidate from their party. Whichever candidate then wins the majority in a state, no matter how big or small it may be, wins all the electoral votes of that state. And in total, to win the race to the Oval Office, a candidate must win 270 and more votes across 50 states. So when Americans say this,
I love her. I am so glad to see a presidential nominee who is youthful and joyful, and I think that reflects right back onto the Democrats. My first time voting in a presidential election, and I could not be happier.
I don't know the exact numbers, but I know the last election, I think Trump got like 88 or 90% of the vote here. I think he's going to get that again.
The courts will take care of that. Let's take care of them in November.
what they really mean is that they will vote for the delegates who represent their political party. And then, those delegates will vote for the presidential candidate from their respective parties.
Kamala, you are fired! You're fired! Get out! Get out!
It's time to turn the page.
However, the delegates don't have to necessarily vote for the candidate that the population wants to give its vote to. In fact, electors are free to vote against the wishes of the people. And this is despite having been elected as a delegate by the voters. So, with how complex the electoral system is, should the US continue with it, or adapt the much simpler popular voting system? A survey from 2023 shows that a majority of Americans want to do away with the Electoral College. A Pew Research study shows that nearly 2/3 of US citizens want popular voting. Americans say that it would truly reflect the mood of the nation for who should sit in the Oval Office. That's because a presidential candidate could win the popular vote, which means that more people voted for them, but they could lose the presidential race due to the Electoral College, where the victor is decided by the number of delegates and not the votes of the people. The Pew study has some more insights on the issue. It says that Democrats are far more likely than Republicans to support moving to the popular vote. On aggregate, over 80% of Democrats say that they would like to have the popular voting system in America. In contrast, about 45% of Republicans share the same sentiments. Moving away from party ideologies and towards demographies, almost 70% of Americans under the age of 50 prefer the popular vote. On the other hand, Americans who are 65 and older want the Electoral College to continue.
A very nice call from Kamala.
The current system allows a candidate to lose the popular vote but still win the Electoral College. This occurred both in the 2000 and the 2016 elections, which were won by George W. Bush and Donald Trump respectively. However, the only way to change the Electoral College would be through a constitutional amendment. But amending the Constitution is a Herculean task. The last time it was done was in the year 1992, and it was about raising salaries for congressional lawmakers. So, for now, it looks like Americans will have to keep voting using the Electoral College to elect their president.
As borders are, Kamala threw open our borders and allowed 20 million illegal aliens to stampede into our country from all over the world.
Every U.S. citizen has the right to vote. And this year, every eligible voter's ballot will decide who will be the next U.S. president. The 2024 race for the White House will see over 200 million Americans cast their vote.
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
However, there are over 350 million people living in the United States. So why isn't the number of eligible voters higher? And is voting restricted only to American citizens? Voting is a fundamental and guaranteed right to citizens of the United States. Only they are allowed to cast their ballot to be eligible. Here's what the requirements are. A person has to be a U.S. citizen. This could be through birth in the U.S., through birth overseas to parents who are U.S. citizens. Then there is the process of naturalization. It is the process of voluntarily becoming a U.S. citizen, and then you also have to be 18 years and older on voting day. If you meet these requirements, then you may register to become a voter and cast your ballot in the U.S. elections. So U.S. citizens can cast their vote and pick their next president. They can also pick their governors and mayors by voting in the state and local elections. But what about those who are not U.S. citizens but are living in the country? This includes people who are in America on work visas or those who have acquired lawful permanent resident status, also known as green cards. But what about the 50 million international tourists and the 1 million plus international students? And millions of illegal migrants? Can these people also cast their vote? Here's what the rules say. Lawful permanent residents or green card holders cannot vote in the federal elections. This includes the presidential, Senate and House of Representatives races. Additionally, green card holders also cannot vote in state elections. That's because most U.S. states follow federal law. However, green card holders can exercise their voting rights in certain towns and cities where local law allows them to vote. States like Maryland and Vermont allow green card holders to vote. However, U.S. federal law allows green card holders to participate in other political activity. This can include volunteering in political campaigns or advocating for social issues. And what about the others? Well, apart from green card holders, international tourists, students, people on work visas or illegal migrants cannot cast their ballot in either the federal, state, or local elections. However, they can take part in political events and campaigns, but only as volunteers. This brings us to the question, why is citizenship and voting a raging debate in the United States? It all started in February, when Tesla CEO and tech billionaire Elon Musk sparked a debate on his social media platform X. He questioned U.S. President Joe Biden's migration policy. Musk said that Biden purposely had weak borders so that millions of illegal migrants could enter the U.S. Musk added that the Biden administration would fast-track citizenship for those migrants and create a permanent majority, a one-party state. The billionaire said that this was the strategy of the Democrats to ensure that they win the 2024 presidential race. Musk's tweet was not taken seriously at the time, but that all changed in June, when Joe Biden announced that he would give citizenship to 500,000 people who are undocumented spouses of Americans but have been living in the United States for over 10 years and more.
Today I'm announcing a common sense fix to streamline the process for obtaining legal status for immigrants.
And that's when the Republicans jumped on the matter. At least 16 Republican states are suing the Biden administration for this move. Elon Musk says the Democrats are importing voters. The Republican-led states argue that Biden has bypassed congressional laws to fast-track citizenship for blatant political purposes. However, the Democrats have hit back. Vice President Kamala Harris has called it Republican strategy to tear apart families. Harris has accused the Republicans of hindering the process of legalizing the migrant status of millions.
Donald Trump believes a border deal would hurt his campaign. So he ordered his allies in Congress to kill the deal. Well, I refuse to play politics with our security, and here is my pledge to you. As president, I will bring back the bipartisan border security bill that he killed, and I will sign it into law.
This brings us to the question, how easy is it to get voting rights as a migrant? And will Biden's citizenship policy benefit the Democrats? Joe Biden's citizenship eligibility program for spouses has crucial details about becoming a citizen. The program allows undocumented spouses of Americans who have lived in the U.S. for at least 10 years or more as of June 17, 2024. To apply for citizenship, they should have no criminal history and will have to provide extensive documentation of taxes and their marital status. Once the application is approved, the qualifying applicant will have 3 years to obtain a green card or risk deportation. And after getting a green card, they can apply for naturalization or full U.S. citizenship. This means that the almost 500,000 spouses of Americans will not be eligible to vote in this year's election. However, the Democrats are being criticized for pulling this move in an election year, which is in stark contrast to Donald Trump's proposal of mass deportations.
We will do large deportations.
Additionally, the path to U.S. citizenship takes roughly a decade. So the influx of immigrants during Biden's tenure will also not have a direct impact in this year's election. However, it will steer how Americans will vote this year, with border security remaining one of the top concerns. Meanwhile, both Elon Musk and Donald Trump continue to claim that the Democrats are signing up illegal migrants onto voter lists, even though they have not come forward with any evidence for their claims. Additionally, there is not enough research on whether migrants who get U.S. citizenship prefer to vote for Democrats or Republicans. So the fact still remains, despite these wild claims, that only American citizens choose their president.
On the 5th of November 2024, millions across all 50 states in the United States will vote to pick their next president. In the U.S., the winner is not the candidate who gets the most votes across the country, which is the popular vote. Instead, both candidates compete to win contests across the 50 states. But over years, electorates in some of these states have been good reflectors of the voting behavior of the entire country. These states are called the bellwether states. They tend to reliably match the countrywide outcome of the presidential election. So, candidates favored in the bellwether states mostly end up winning the election. These states are Ohio, Nevada, New Mexico, Florida, Colorado, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania. Let's begin with Ohio, the Buckeye State. It has historically been a bellwether state and continues to hold on to that status. The candidate who wins Ohio usually has a very good chance of spending the next 4 years in the Oval Office. The state holds the highest bellwether percentage at 90.9%. It has held that status for 14 presidential election cycles, across 60 years, from Lyndon Johnson's landslide win in 1964 to Donald Trump's victory in 2016. Ohio's choice won the Electoral College in every election. It held the longest streak of a bellwether state, until 2020, when the Buckeye State recorded its first miss. It gave a majority of its vote to then-incumbent President Donald Trump. The former president had an 8-point margin of victory in the state, but Trump still lost to Joe Biden in the National Vote and Electoral College. Next is Nevada, the Silver State, and the only other state of all the bellwether states to compete with Ohio's record. Nevada shares the bellwether percentage with Ohio at 90.9%. Since 1976, Democratic and Republican candidates have won Nevada 6 times each, and the winner in Nevada has gone to the White House in 10 of the last 12 elections. But just like Ohio, Nevada too has had one miss since 1980. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the state over Donald Trump, who won the presidential election.
Instead of taking charge that night, Hillary Clinton decided to go home and sleep. Incredible.
In 2020, the state was back to its winning ways, when Joe Biden carried the state. The state has just 6 electoral votes, but no presidential candidate ever been able to take the Silver State for granted, because it's also a swing state. The third is New Mexico. It has a bellwether percentage of 81.8%. Since the 1980s, it has only gone wrong twice in calling the election. In the year 2000, the state sided with Al Gore over George W. Bush, with a vote margin of just 366 votes.
I mean, I'm sure there's some people in this state that say, I don't like George W. because who his dad is. Very few are saying they don't like George W. because who my mother is, by the way.
In the year 2016, Hillary Clinton carried the state, while Donald Trump won the presidency. If we consider statistics from the year 1912, which is when New Mexico became a state, then the number of misfires for New Mexico goes up to 3. In 1976, New Mexico picked the incumbent Gerald Ford, but Democrat Jimmy Carter won the presidency. Fourth bellwether state is Florida. The Sunshine State also has an impressive record. With an overall bellwether percentage of 81.8%, Florida has only gotten it wrong twice since 1980. Once in 1992, when it voted for incumbent George H. Bush, and Bill Clinton won the presidency.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And in 2020, when the state voted red backing Donald Trump, but Democrat Joe Biden swept the presidential election. Next is Colorado. The Centennial State is also high on the list of bellwether states. Colorado's bellwether percentage stands at 81.8%. This state too has had 2 misfires in the last 43 years. Like Florida, Colorado too backed George H. Bush in 1992, and the state voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but Donald Trump pulled off a massive upset. Sixth is New Hampshire. The Granite State shares its bellwether percentage with Colorado at 81.8%. The 2 misses on its record are from the year 2004 and 2016, when incumbent President George W. Bush won a second term in office, but New Hampshire picked Democrat John Kerry. And in 2016, when the state threw its weight behind Hillary Clinton.
Thank you so much!
The 7th and last on the list is Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. It also a bellwether percentage of 81.8%, but the state had back-to-back failures in the year 2000 and 2004. It rejected George W. Bush in 2 consecutive presidential elections, voting for Al Gore in the year 2000 and John Kerry in 2004. Pennsylvania chose blue, but Bush left it red-faced. With 19 electoral votes, Pennsylvania is also a swing state. The United States also has 19 bellwether counties across 50 states. From 1980 to 2016, These 19 counties have voted for the winner of the presidential election. Every single time. In fact, Valencia County in New Mexico has had the most impressive feat. It has been voting for the winner since 1952. But the 2020 presidential election was a blot on their record. 18 out of the 19 bellwether counties got it wrong that year. They voted for former President Donald Trump. They backed him not marginally but in huge numbers. But Joe Biden won the presidency. The only one whose record was intact was Clallam County in Washington, that voted for Biden. So which way will these counties and states go this November? Will they help Donald Trump return to the Oval Office?
From the day I take the oath of office,
Or will they ensure Kamala Harris scripts history by becoming the first female president of the United States?
It was the same old show. Same old tired playbook we've heard for years.
On November 5th, as voting gets underway in America,
A quick reminder. Vote.
all eyes will be on these 7 bellwether states and the 19 counties to indicate which way the wind is blowing.
The U.S. goes to polls on November 5th. The country will choose its next president. It will either be Kamala Harris from the Democratic Party or Donald Trump from the Republican Party. While there are other third-party candidates, the real race is between these two. So, who will vote for Harris? And who will try and bring Trump back to power?
too much competition.
Right. One way to look at potential voters is through the lens of race. The U.S. is home to more than 333 million people. This is according to the last census, taken in 2022. Now, let's break up that figure by race. About 58.9% of the U.S. population identifies as white. About 19.1% are Hispanic. Black people make up 12.6% of the U.S. population. Then, you have people of Asian descent who make up 6.1%. 2.4% of America is multiracial. 0.7% are Native American people. And Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up 0.2% of the population. That's the demographic breakup of the U.S. population according to the 2022 census. Let's look at the 4 biggest demographic groups, the ones most likely to influence the 2024 election. You have white people, Hispanic people, Black people, and people of Asian descent. In the last few U.S. elections, these 4 groups have made up 96 to 98% of the U.S. electorate. Look at this chart to see the composition of voters. You'll notice that it doesn't correspond to the population breakup. Even though white Americans make up less than 60% of the population, about 74% of the people who vote are white. This means white people have a disproportionately high say in the election compared to their population. Black voters come close to representing their share of the U.S. population. But Hispanic people and people of Asian descent do not have a proportional say. They have historically been underrepresented at the ballot box. So, while the 4 major racial groups do decide U.S. elections, white people have the biggest say by far. So, how do the different American racial groups usually vote? We'll look at the last 4 elections for clues. These are the 2016 presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, then the 2018 midterms, the 2020 presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and then the 2022 midterms. Here's the voter breakup by race for these elections. The most obvious difference is the percentage of white voters. White voters have made up about 62% of the Democratic Party's voter base. This is across the last 4 elections. In contrast, white people made up about 87% of the Republican Party's voter base. They are the driving force behind the Republicans, and it seems more white people vote for the GOP than for the Democrats. This has consistently been the case. Let's zoom in on the last election. In the 2022 midterms, 57% of all white voters choose the Republican Party. 41% voted for the Democrats, and 2% cast their votes elsewhere. So Republicans have the edge when it comes to white voters. But that edge is blunted when the black vote comes into play. Let's look at the 2022 midterm statistics again. A whopping 93% of all black voters chose the Democrats. 93%. And remember, black people are relatively well represented at the ballot box. So we can say that most black Americans vote blue. This has been proven time and again. In the last 4 elections, black people on average made up more than 17% of the Democratic Party's voter base. 17% versus only 1% on average for the Republican Party. Now we look at Hispanic people. They make up almost 20% of the US population. But when it comes to voting, they only make up about 9% of the electorate. It shows that Hispanic people are very underrepresented at the polling booth. But this 9% is still significant. It can turn the tide of any election. So Hispanic people are definitely a key demographic in the US. Like black voters, Hispanic voters traditionally lean towards the Democrats, but the difference in party choice is far less pronounced. Between 2016 and 2022, Hispanic people made up about 12% of the Democratic voter base on average. For the Republicans, this number was about half. About 6% of Republican voters over the last few elections have been Hispanic people. It's a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the Democrats. But these numbers aren't set in stone. You'll notice that over time, Hispanic support for the Democrats has stagnated, whereas it has gone up for the Republicans. The swing is still minor, but this year's election could solidify the migration. And it proves that America's Hispanic population still has a big say in elections, even if it isn't proportional to the community's size. Then we have the people of Asian descent, America's fastest growing demographic. They make up only 6.1% of the population right now, according to the 2022 census. But that's 27% higher than the proportion of Asian people in 2010. So the population of Asian people in the US grew by 27% between 2010 and 2022. That's much faster than any other demographic group. If this growth continues, people of Asian descent will continue to have a greater say in American politics as the years go by. Historically, this is another group that has leaned towards the Democrats, even more than Hispanic people. In 2022, 68% of all Asian Americans voted blue, compared to 60% of all Hispanic voters. So both the groups lean towards the Democratic Party, but Asian Americans slightly more so. People of Asian descent made up about 4% of the Democratic Party's voter base over the last 4 elections. That fell to about 2% for the Republicans. But again, there's a caveat here. In 2016 and 2018, barely any Asian Americans voted red. But in the 2020 presidential elections, Asian American support for the Republicans surged. They made up 3% of the Republican voter base. It was a historic high. With Trump contesting again, more Asian Americans might be tempted to vote red once more.
Thank you, everybody.
So that's how the biggest racial groups in the US usually vote. White people lean towards the Republicans. Black people overwhelmingly vote for the Democrats. Hispanic people and people of Asian descent have historically voted in favor of the Democrats as well. But the gap seems to be narrowing. And this should worry Kamala Harris and encourage Donald Trump. On November 5th, all eyes will be on America. The country will head to the ballot box, and they have a choice to make: Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Who will the United States choose?
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States.
I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America.
Now, no one can predict the election results. We will only know when it's declared. But behind the votes, there's another story. A story of numbers, statistics, and predictions. The story of polls. We hear about them during every presidential election. In some states, Donald Trump is leading. In the others, it's Kamala Harris. These polls are crucial to each election. They shape narratives. They influence campaigns. And sometimes, they even leave the entire nation baffled. In 2016 and 2020, the polls got it wrong. Can they get it right this time? And what do these opinion polls mean for the American democracy? The year was 1948. The date was November 3rd. This was the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune. It read, "Dewey defeats Truman." But here's the catch. Thomas E. Dewey did not win that election. Harry S. Truman did. So, why did the paper print that headline? A year before the elections, the Chicago Daily Tribune had changed the way it printed its paper. So, the copy needed to go to print earlier. That was the case, too, on that night. Most states had not declared their results, but the paper took a leap of faith. After all, every poll said that Dewey would win. So, they went ahead with this copy. It went to press. But by next morning, it was a completely different result. The polls predicted a Dewey win. Instead, it was a Truman triumph. He even posed with the Chicago Daily Tribune copy. Now, polling has been a part of American elections for over a century. It started with simple straw polls. As technology advanced, so did the methods. Now, they are complex statistical analyses. So, how do the polls work? It's all about three things: data, sampling, and the art of asking the right questions. At its core, a poll is a survey. It's a way to measure the opinions of a specific group. But in a country as large and diverse as the United States, it's impossible to ask everyone. So, pollsters rely on sampling. Age, gender, race, location. These are all factors that are considered before building a sample. Then, there are the methods. How do you contact the sample group? Pollsters use landlines, cell phones, and online surveys. Each method has its advantages and drawbacks. More importantly, each one can influence the outcome of the poll. For example, imagine it's an online survey. Chances are the answers will come from a younger generation. Also, chances are they will be more educated. So, pollsters must keep that in mind. Once the data is collected, it's analyzed. It is then adjusted for various factors like non-response bias, which occurs when survey participants either can't or won't respond to a survey question. Finally, it is presented to the public as the polls that we see. So it's a science, but one with inherent uncertainties. Take 1980, for example. Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan. Polls predicted a close race. However, Reagan won by a landslide. So, why did the polls go wrong? It's the voter sentiment in the end. Reagan performed well in the presidential debate that was held a week before the election. It convinced many undecided voters. They ended up voting for him. And the polls completely missed this. Then there's 2000, George W. Bush versus Al Gore. Many polls predicted an Al Gore win. Now, while Gore did win the popular vote, the outcome depended on the Electoral College. Polls underestimated that. It did not take into consideration the razor-thin margins in key states. So it was a blot on the reputation of polls. But 2016 really changed the game. It's when America woke up to how wrong these polls could be. Polls predicted an overwhelming victory for Hillary Clinton. Yet on election night, Donald Trump emerged as the 45th president of the United States. So what went wrong? Well, there are several factors at play. The first was the underestimation of Trump's support in key battleground states. Pollsters missed crucial pockets of voters. That's the rural, white working class. They turned out in larger numbers than expected. The second was education levels. Non-educated voters weren't well represented in the samples, and they turned out to be pivotal in Trump's victory. The third was late deciding voters, those who swung towards Trump in the final days of the campaign. Polls didn't capture this last-minute shift. But here was the biggest issue: the failure to account for this shy Trump voter. These voters supported Trump, but were reluctant to declare it. Hillary may have lost the election, but the biggest loser of 2016 were the pollsters. So 4 years later, the polling industry vowed to learn from its mistakes. In 2020, the polls once again predicted a clear winner. It was Joe Biden. This time, the prediction was correct, but there was an issue. The margin was far narrower than expected. Despite making adjustments, pollsters underestimated Trump's support again. The problems were the same as 2016. So, what will it be in 2024? Pollsters are now looking at new technologies: AI, big data, and social media analytics. They want to use it to improve accuracy. But will it be enough? Will pollsters get it right this time? Or will they be wrong for the third time? Whatever the answer is, one thing is clear: polls will remain a critical part of the presidential elections, but they are not infallible. And in the end, it's the people, not the polls, who ultimately decide who will be in the White House.
If there's one thing the year 2024 will be remembered for, it'll be elections. From India to Britain, the European Union to South Korea, South Africa, Finland, France, Taiwan, and even Russia. Over 60 nations held elections this year. However, it's not over yet. One last global election remains, and it's just around the corner. The United States, the world's oldest modern democracy, is set to vote this November. Americans will be choosing their 47th president. And running for the White House are former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. The presidential race in the U.S. happens every 4 years. However, there is something constant in each election that has remained unchanged for over 175 years, and that is the day of the week when the elections are held: Tuesday. This year as well, Americans will be voting on November 5th, which is also a Tuesday. So why is Tuesday connected to America's democracy? Well, it's a bit of coincidence and tradition. The election day in the United States has been set in stone by federal law. The U.S. law calls for a presidential poll to be held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. But how did the November Tuesday become so important for U.S. democracy? Let's find out. The U.S. Constitution does not designate a specific day for holding elections. However, it allows Congress to select the time and day for choosing electors or delegates. These delegates, in turn, vote to elect the president and vice president. The Constitution also gives some rights to the states to choose the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. However, it also permits Congress to make or alter those state rules. So if the day hasn't been fixed, then how did Tuesday come into the picture? The U.S. declared itself independent from Britain in 1776. The United States ratified its constitution in 1788. This was followed by the first elections that were held between November of 1788 and June 1789. Yes, voting that is now done within 1 day took up to 6 months when it first began. And subsequent elections continued to be chaotic. Things changed more than 5 decades later when the 1840 presidential election saw widespread voting fraud. In response, then Representative Alexander Duncan proposed a uniform election day for both presidential and House elections in 1844. The bill initially sought to require all states to hold their elections on a single day. That is on Tuesday after the first Monday in November. While the House passed the bill, the Senate didn't table it before the 1844 election. Alexander Duncan reintroduced the bill in the next session, this time focusing solely on the presidential election. Various amendments were proposed during the bill's consideration. Ultimately, the House adopted the bill, and the Senate passed it with minor corrections. The bill was signed into law on January 23, 1845, by President John Tyler, making Tuesday the official day for Americans to vote for their president. But the mystery remains: why choose a Tuesday? Historians say the answer lies in 19th-century American lifestyle. The choice of Tuesday in November is deeply rooted on the country's agrarian culture of the time. November was ideal because it followed the completion of the harvest season. The month also avoided conflicts with both planting in the spring and early fall. This meant that farmers could plant their crop and travel to vote, which would take days in those times. Additionally, Tuesday was chosen due to religious reasons. In Christian practice, the term Sabbath is often used to refer to Sunday. It recognizes the day of Jesus Christ's resurrection, and many Christians would observe a weekly day of rest and worship on Sunday. In the 19th century, polling stations were quite far from rural areas, and for voters, particularly farmers, it meant at least a day-long journey. So to avoid forcing people to travel on the holy day of Sabbath, Monday was not considered, and Wednesday, which was designated as the market day for farmers, was also rejected. Naturally, Tuesday emerged as the prime choice and eventually became the official day. However, Tuesday as an election day has had its fair share of opposition. Modern-day political experts say that voting on a weekend would see an increase in turnout. They argue that holding election on a Tuesday hinders voter access due to work commitments. One of the organizations leading the cause to reassign voting day is called Why Tuesday? Founded in 2005, the group raises awareness about America's low voter turnout. It aims to highlight the lack of accessible voting options, and they are leading the fight to move election day to the weekend. Many countries hold elections on weekends. Australia, Germany, France, and Japan generally conduct elections on Saturdays or Sundays. Brazil votes on the first Sunday of October, with runoffs on the last Sunday if needed. Meanwhile, Mexico shifted from the first Sunday of July to the first Sunday of June from 2021. The European Union also typically holds its parliament election on a weekend. However, in the Anglosphere, such as the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, elections are typically held on weekdays. It is influenced by historical Christian practice of observing Sabbath. Meanwhile, in India, elections occur over multiple days with different phases for various constituencies. In the case of the United States, it's worth noting that while federal elections are on a Tuesday, state and local elections have more flexibility. However, many states align their elections with the federal date simply for convenience. On November 5th, the Tuesday after the first Monday of November, millions of Americans will line up at polling booths. They will exercise their fundamental right of self-governance. As for the Tuesday election day, the law that has continued for over 175 years faces little opposition and will likely remain for many more years to come.
Terrible, the worst vice president in history.
I will get rid of the unnecessary degree requirements for federal jobs.
No matter how much Kamala Harris tries to change her image, she cannot change this fact.
On November 5th, Americans will decide the future of the United States. The neck-and-neck battle between Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump and Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris will come to an end.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the worst administration in the history of our country.
He said,
Comrade Kamala Harris, comrade.
okay, it's going to be a tight race until the end, and we are the underdog.
Because I am your border president from now on.
With one of them being voted as the next U.S. president, along with the commander-in-chief. The nation will also get its 50th vice president. Either Republican J.D. Vance or Democrat Tim Walz will take over the post, currently held by Kamala Harris, who became the first woman, first Black American, and first South Asian American to become vice president in 2021. Traditionally, the vice presidency has been a relatively insignificant position in U.S. politics. For some people, the job mostly amounts to attending funerals on behalf of the president or assisting them with moral support. In fact, the first vice president of the United States, John Adams, called it the most insignificant office. Former President Abraham Lincoln's vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, used to refer to himself as the most unimportant man in Washington. And ex-President Franklin Roosevelt's Vice President John Nance Garner famously said the vice presidency does not worth a bucket of warm spit. But times have changed in recent decades. The office has become more important and influential than ever. To be the deputy of the U.S. president, you just need to have 3 qualifications. First, you should be at least 35 years of age. Second, you must be a natural-born citizen of the United States. And lastly, you should have lived in the country for at least 14 years. And what will you exactly do as the U.S. Vice President? Let's dive in. The American Constitution, which was written nearly 237 years ago, mentions the role of the Vice President only a handful of times. The second in command is also the first in line to succeed the president in case of death, resignation, or impeachment. So far, 8 U.S. presidents have died in office, and one president, Richard Nixon, resigned, leaving their deputies in control of the White House.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Meanwhile, 6 other vice presidents, including Joe Biden, went on to win their own terms. The Vice President of the United States is also the chief presiding officer of the U.S. Senate. The Constitution says they can't participate in debates and have no power to vote, though they have to cast vote in an event of a tie. In December last year, Kamala Harris set the record for breaking the most ties in the U.S. Senate.
Vice President Harris has just cast her 32nd tie-breaking vote, the most tiebreakers ever.
The Constitution also says that the Vice President should attend Senate sessions as a full-time occupant. This is how Vice Presidents have largely spent their time, right from the inception of the position in 1789 to roughly the middle of the 20th century. However, that isn't the reality anymore. In modern practice, they spend less time in the Senate, and the senior-most member of the majority party presides in place of them. Apart from the previous 2 powers, the only other duty that the Constitution gives to the Vice President is to oversee the counting of electoral votes after a presidential election. But the Vice President is also responsible for announcing the next President and Vice President of the country. This might sound like a strange part of the job, but it's meant to take away the jitters. Because if a person is going to be the next Vice President, they'd be happy to announce it themselves. But in case they are defeated, then it could be embarrassing for some to make the declaration of defeat in front of hundreds of people.
The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 306 votes. Michael R. Pence of the state of Indiana has received 232 votes.
Evidently, the role of the Vice President started out small, but it has gradually expanded under both Republican and Democratic governments. For instance, Walter Mondale, who served as the Vice President between 1977 to 1981, was given his own office in the West Wing of the White House by his President Jimmy Carter. This was to make Mondale an integral part of President Carter's inner circle. The tradition continues till today. However, before that, vice presidents had to work out of a building across the street from the White House. Over the years, some vice presidents have taken their role to a whole another level. This includes someone from not too distant past, Dick Cheney, one of the most powerful vice presidents of all time. It was September 11, 2001, when Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial planes in the United States, and 2 planes had already hit the World Trade Center. President George W. Bush was evacuated on Air Force One, and he could not be reached due to spotty network. At that time, Cheney had no option left but to take charge, and from the bunker, he authorized to shoot down any plane attempting another attack. The hijacked planes, of course, carried American civilians. Luckily, the order did not need to be carried out, but this vital decision showed how important a U.S. vice president really is. More recently, Donald Trump's Vice President Mike Pence had to make one of the most crucial decisions in the history of U.S. politics. In 2021, the House of Representatives called on him to strip Trump of power and become the acting president in the wake of the Capitol Hill riots.
I joined the Senate Democratic leader in calling on the Vice President to remove this president by immediately invoking the 25th Amendment. If the Vice President and the Cabinet do not act, the Congress may be prepared to move forward with impeachment.
However, Pence proved to be a loyal ally of Trump and avoided taking that action. Though he did infuriate Trump by announcing Joe Biden's victory and putting an end to his president's futile efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes.
Vice presidents in modern history are no longer the last voice in the room for the U.S. president. They are leaders who time and again restore public trust in the government, unlike the president. A vice president has no fixed limit on terms and can serve forever.
Team that actually has a
That's why today running mates are scrutinized by the voters much more closely than in the past. So who will be the next vice president of the United States? Tim Walz or J.D. Vance? We will find out in November.
This is the U.S. presidential race, where numbers matter, policies matter, but so do the optics. This is a grand theater of politics, where, like with any theatrical display, amid the pomp and pageantry, costumes can make all the difference. Why is that? And how do the candidates use it to their advantage?
Her biggest advantage is that she's a beautiful woman.
Don't you find some of their stuff to just be plain weird?
I'm a better looking person than Kamala.
Well, Donald, I do hope you'll reconsider.
August 23rd. This was one of the most consequential days for Kamala Harris, when she accepted her nomination as the Democratic candidate for president.
We can do together. We are so honored to be your nominees. This is a people-powered campaign, and together we will chart a new way forward.
While this happened, many women at the Democratic National Convention were wearing white. So were many other speakers. But Harris chose to wear blue. This wasn't just to stand out of the crowd. After all, a presidential candidate doesn't have to try very hard to do that. Here, her navy blue suit had symbolic meaning.
America
America's ready for a better story. We are ready for a President Kamala Harris.
To understand this, let's go back. The year was 2016. History was made in the United States. The first woman candidate was nominated for president, Hillary Clinton. Clinton had climbed up the stage in a white suit. Why white? Because for her, this was symbol of all the women before her who fought for a political voice. From the suffragists to Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman vice presidential candidate. Since that moment in 2016, the white pantsuit is a symbolic weapon in the US. It is a political trope. Harris has used this weapon once before. In 2020, when US President Joe Biden declared the election victory, Harris became the first woman vice president of the United States, and she chose to wear white, again, in honor of the women who came before her.
I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs.
But this time, as Harris accepted her presidential nomination, she wore blue to close a chapter and stand out on her own terms. Because for her, wearing suits is not just an easy, obvious choice. It is tactical. Suits have become her uniform since before her days of vice presidency. Harris has appeared in neutral pantsuits, usually in shades of black, dark blue, burgundy, and beige. Now, power suits are kind of the go-to for US presidential candidates, so Hillary Clinton did it as well, as a self-described pantsuit aficionado, but usually in rainbow colors. This was her way to bridge the male-female fashion divide. But this doesn't mean everyone wears suits. Like former Republican presidential contender
Miss Nikki Haley!
She often wore dresses and skirts, especially during the Republican presidential debates, mainly to differentiate herself and stand out among the other Republican hopefuls. But why are we talking about this? Why does it matter what women presidential candidates wear? First, because they are in the presidential race, and a president doesn't dress to represent themselves, but the country, so the stakes are high. And secondly, because they are women. Studies show that when voters are asked to close their eyes and picture a US president, most of them come up with the same image, a white man.
Well, folks, it's time to turn the page.
So voters don't know what a woman in office looks like, let alone a potentially pioneering woman president, if elected.
I've served with her. I know her. I trust her.
Harris will be the first female president, the first female president of color, and the first president of South Asian descent.
But while I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last.
So voters don't know what a woman president will or should look like. But research confirms that they scrutinize a woman president's appearance more than a male candidate's. For instance, a flyaway hair is an indication of sloppy thinking. Is this unfair? Of course. Even former US President Barack Obama acknowledged the double standard when he spoke about Hillary Clinton. He said,
"She had to do everything that I had to do, except, like Ginger Rogers, backward in heels. She had to wake up earlier than I did because she had to get her hair done. She had to, handle all the expectations that were placed on her."
And we witnessed the proof. When Clinton didn't do this, when she tied her hair in a ponytail, it led to an entire debate about the meaning of the scrunchie. So, as things stand, how Harris equips herself for the role matters, and better yet, she can use it to her advantage, and she has. like when Harris wore 3 different black designers for President Biden's inauguration. But it is not just Harris who needs to worry about fashion. So does Donald Trump. The Republican presidential candidate Trump is almost always in a suit. By the Italian luxury brand Brioni, with a broad-shouldered tailoring.
And a tie.
And this tie is a tactical play as well. It is really long, which experts say is worn that way to make him look taller and thinner. And it is almost always red.
Why?
Because put together with a suit and tie, Trump looks like a walking, talking American flag. This is the look. His signature red tie, his white shirt, and his blue suit. Trump embraces these patriotic hues more than any of his predecessors.
Happy birthday, President Trump.
And the flag seems to be his muse. Because, fun fact, Trump's birthday falls on June 14, which also happens to be Flag Day in the US. Now, Trump wore the same combination even before he entered politics. But over time, his uniform has evolved.
I am the chosen one. Somebody had to do it.
The blue has become brighter in recent months, and the red ties have become even more common. Now, he is not alone here. Former US President Ronald Reagan was also known for his red ties. This was symbolic of his Republican representation, but no one loves it like Trump. He does switch it up though, like during his New York hush money trial. He wore blue and gold ties. He was taking space from his political uniform, but he always reverts to the combination during the high-stakes events. He wore it in 2016, when he won the presidency. He wore it for his first official news conference as the president, for State of the Union addresses in 2019 and 2020, for his speech at January 6th rally in 2021, for his exit from the White House in 2021, for his mug shot, and even for his first official TikTok post. He wears the flag. He is surrounded by flags.
Why?
Experts say it is a visual representation of patriotism and nationalism. So, when people see him, they see the flag. So, in the run-up to November 5th, both Trump and Harris are using fashion as a soft power, albeit differently. But they both have the same goal. They have each devised their own wardrobe language. They are both power dressing for the job they want. To be the President of the United States, arguably the most powerful person in the world.
Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma.